Hello, my name is Jason Buffington from Veeam Software, and today we're going to look at 1,000 cyber attacks. Now, that may actually seem like a bold statement, but it's true. An independent research firm surveyed 1,000 unbiased IT organizations in the spring of 2022. One of the key things about this particular research, it's the largest of its kind, and it specifically surveyed four different kinds of IT professionals, all of which have different viewpoints on cybersecurity and ransomware pervasiveness, preparedness, and hopefully remediation. That included 400 security professionals, 200 IT operations generalists, 200 backup administrators, and 200 CISOs or executives that are responsible for the overall stance of the company. You can download the report that we're going to be citing from today at vee.am/RW22. Now, before we actually get into the research of this ransomware trends report for 2022, this was actually spawned by some insights that were found out of a previous report that Veeam published, which is actually the largest of its kind. Nearly 3,400 respondents worldwide, 28 countries around the world. This is our marquee annual data protection trends report. And in that research, one of the key questions was, what would you consider to be the defining aspect of a modern data protection solution? Interestingly enough, the third most highest response of what does modern data protection look like? Modern data protection integrates as part of a comprehensive data security strategy. Now, no one is better suited to explain what does that really look like and how is Veeam making sure that our data protection is part of a comprehensive security strategy than my friend Chris Hoff. Chris, welcome to the call, and introduce yourself. What are we going to be talking about today?
Hey, thanks, Jason. So I'm Chris Hoff. I'm product marketing manager here for data security, and I've spent 20 years, actually over 20 years, in cybersecurity. So I've seen a lot, and I've got the thinning hairline to prove it. And today what we're going to talk about is facts about what's happening in the ransomware world, in the cyber world, and some thoughts on what we can do to give ourselves a better chance to recover quickly and, frankly, not pay a ransom.
There you go. You say you've been the security side for 20 years. I've been on the backup side for 30. And interestingly enough, up until the last couple years, our various teams didn't really talk to each other. And that's actually going to set us up for the very first thing that we're going to talk about. We've got about 6 areas that we're going to discover as part of the research from today. And the first one is really looking at alignment across organizations along the way. But beyond that, the next topics we'll cover, we'll talk about pervasiveness and how rampant ransomware is across organizations and within an organization. We're going to talk about the money, right? And that's part of where this happens. We're going to talk about restoration. We'll talk about the importance of immutability and then some operational considerations along the way. But back to the first question, and I mentioned this before, historically, cyber, your part of the world, backup, my part of the world, BCDR, something that ought to glue us together, hasn't typically been well aligned. So this actually comes from first the data protection trends research, where organizations were asked, is cyber part of one's BCDR strategy? Our friend Melissa Palmer often has been bannering for the last couple of years, ransomware is a disaster. And so I love the idea that it looks like more and more organizations are doing that. Now, for the ransomware survey, we asked all four types of professionals the same question. Chris, what did you see here, and does this surprise you?
So it gives me some hope, actually. So you're absolutely right that for years security and BCDR have been kind of two separate islands, and ransomware has kind of forced us together because we security people just assumed that the data would be there and you just restore. And we're finding with the scope of ransomware that that's just not the case in many organizations. And so the backup folks and the security folks need to be working more tightly together. But what's really interesting is, and we've talked about this before, is that the the number of CISOs or management level folks who think that things are going great is higher than the number of kind of frontline people who kind of see the cracks in the armor and see where some improvement is needed.
Well, that's a great setup for our next slide. So this first one talks about cyber versus BCDR as a strategy, right? And I think one of the takeaways that folks at home should be listening for is from a strategy, you ought to be thinking about ransomware is a disaster, right? So the same way you think about the kinds of calamity and risk of fire and flood and earthquake and theft and power, certainly ransomware has the potential to create that same kind of massive outage and massive ramifications over time. So I love the fact that the strategies are aligned. But Chris, to your point, when the organizations were looking at the teams, in this case, the backup team, my people, the cyber team, your people, we see something which isn't quite as optimistic along the way. You want to break it down for us?
Absolutely. So, like I said, the higher you are up in the organization, you're focused on bigger picture, reducing risk and making sure that your cyber strategy is aligned with the business goals. The that takes you away from kind of the day-to-day operations where maybe we don't have such good communication between groups, and maybe there are too many assumptions being made about what the capabilities are on each side. And I think that this graph on the slide really shows the recognition of the work that we still need to do.
Yeah, in fact, for folks that are watching, I want to point you to the right-hand side of the four graphs. This is where the four personas were all asked the same version of the question. Look at the middle two, because one of the common themes that you're going to see over and over when we look at the different four personas is that the backup admins, right? So those are the folks that when everything has gone bad, that's where remediation typically will start from recovering of data. And then, of course, the security professionals right next to them, they're in the third column. They're the ones who have been focused on prevention up until now and are now partnering with backup on the remediation. Those folks that are closest to solving the issue seem to have the sentiment that there is more work to be done. The CISOs on the far right, the IT ops on the far left, they seem a little happier. And I think that's mostly because they're a little more naive as to the ramifications and the practicalities of what really needs to be improved. Chris, does that make sense to you?
It absolutely does. And let's face it, the folks who are on the front lines, if you've got the word engineer in your title, we're predispositioned to look for problems that we need to fix. So it only makes sense that the security professionals and the backup professionals are going to have a slightly more jaded view of the world.
Sure. Um, that said, we do want to emphasize, the idea that backup is part of cyber. This is not a new trend. Chris, I like how you said it before, how you just kind of assumed that, that you'd just recover if you needed it. That it was just there, which kind of brings us to our last piece on this. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time on this, but one of the things that was asked in the survey was around thinking about your incident response team. Those folks that when stuff does happen, because it's gonna, we're going to talk about that. What all is involved in their plan. Now, I'm going to draw your eye first to the bottom of the screen where we see that 3% of organizations said they don't have a team, right? Which in my mind reads, hey, when it goes bad, we're going to figure out who to ask. That's a bad idea, right? Now, then there's 5% next to the bottom that said we don't have a plan, right? That is what we call a resume generating event. That is a good way to lose your job. But for the other 92% of organizations, you can see there's a broad range of things in playbooks. And Chris, I know that you have lived and breathed many of these attributes of this playbook for quite a while. But I got to tell you, my favorite part is that the presumption of backup, that the backup exists, that their data is clean, and they're verified to be recoverable. The fact that those are the top two tenets of most instant team playbooks, I think gives me hope that that we're on the right path.
I totally agree. And you know what they say about assumptions, and frankly, we on the security side have been making that assumption about backup for far too long. And I think that the ransomware problem has really shown a light on that. And we're seeing more and more backup people being brought into things like tabletop exercises and planning meetings as well. So, it's trending in the right direction, I think.
Yeah. Unfortunately, representing the backup half of this conversation, security are not the only people who have been assuming that your backups are recoverable for quite a while. But again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. All right, so that's our first topic, is looking at that alignment between cyber teams, the BCDR strategy, the backup operations folks, and the tool sets. And certainly, if you're joining a call today hosted by Veeam, we are passionate around developing technologies that can fulfill these kinds of initiatives. Now let's get into some of the bad news. So the punchline for this section when we talk about it is you should just plan that you're going to be infected. This is a when, not an if. We're going to talk about that. But to get us started, again, I'm going to lean back into that data protection trends research that we published earlier in the year, back in February of 2022. And you can see here, we looked at all the different things that causes outages in 2020 and 2021. And it's worth noting, if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, the most common reasons for outages, most frequent, is still that stuff breaks, right? Networking breaks and applications break and hardware breaks and OSs crash, and stuff still breaks, right? But when you look at what is most impactful, those are the short lines. The most impactful causes of outages for 2021 and also for 2020 turns out to be humans. And Chris, I'm going to go on a limb here and say, when we talk about humans, it's actually the top two causes, because the top cause is bad humans. And then the second most common cause is, I'm going to say, silly humans, right? Users that delete or overwrite, or bad imports. But we have bad humans, we have silly humans, and those are the causes of outages. We're going to talk a little bit later around those silly humans that clicked on the things made by the bad humans along that way. But certainly the fact that that cyber events are the most impactful cause of outage 2 years in a row, that ought to be getting some people's attention, shouldn't it?
It absolutely should be. And it's easy to think that when we're talking about ransomware, it's an old problem because it's been, that term has been around for 10 years in its current state, and it's evolving. But it is truly its own pandemic within the cyber world. And it's partially because it's so easy to both deliver and make the mistake, to your point about clicking on the link or opening the attachment.
Yeah, that's right. So pandemic is actually probably a great way to describe for this. Let's talk about frequency. So easily one of the scariest pieces of data that came out of the data protection trends report is when respondents. By the way, just you want to be very clear on both of these research sets. These are not Veeam customers. These are not Veeam partners. This was an unbiased sample run by third-party industry analysts. But this is one of the scariest pieces of data that I saw, which was when organizations were asked, how many ransomware attacks has your organization suffered in the last 12 months? 24%, only 24%, 1 in 4 organizations said they had not been attacked yet. I'm going to break out the slide, then I want to get your input, Chris. 16% said they'd only been attacked once, which technically means, when you run the math together, 60%, 3 out of 5 organizations, had been hit 2 or more times over the last 12 months. But Chris, when you and I first started talking about that 24% none, and Danny Allen, our CTO, makes a point to talk about this quite a bit, y'all seem to think this is erroneously high. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. So there's a few things that are potentially going on here. First is that, to my earlier point, people may be putting ransomware in a very specific box of a very specific type of attack. And so they could just simply be incorrectly reporting. The other piece, and I think the more important piece, is they just don't know they've been hit yet because the dwell time for a cyber attack like ransomware can be 3, 6 months. And you just simply don't know it's there until it happens. And so I would posture that these 24% of respondents just simply don't know that they've been hit yet.
That is easily one of the scariest things, and one of the things that I had not appreciated until I first started learning that from you after you joined Veeam a couple of years ago, is the idea that, I think a lot of folks mistake the day that they get the ransomware note is the day after they were hit. Somebody found their way in, they corrupted something, bam, sends out the ransomware note. Okay, pay me back, right? The idea that folks had been dwelling in this for quite a while beforehand just scares the actual bejeebies out of me. But so really, 1 in 4 is the best case scenario, and the high probability is not there. That means 3 out of 4 organizations have been hit at least once along the way. It was data like this that really stimulated, okay, we need to double down. So this was from the data protection trends report. You'll see that, by the way, whenever the notation of the source in the lower left hand corner is orange, that comes from DPR. Now we're going to flip over, because it was because of that we did the ransomware survey, where we said, okay, tell us how bad is it. So in this case, all 1,000 organizations had to have been hit along the way. This might be the second most scariest piece of news that we're going to share for today. So this question asks around what percentage of the organization's production data was successfully encrypted. And if we just put up the 47% number, it would be easy to assume, well, maybe there's just a really few bad actors and there are really few bad days, and it skews the numbers. But Chris, this shows a pretty consistent bell curve, right? So out of the entire 1,000 attacks that was out there, on the edges, 5% got nothing, 3% got everything, and everything else is a pretty even spread across the way. But oh my gosh, 47%, half of the production data now has gone through a meat grinder. That's amazing to me.
It's a lot of data, but the thing that's important to think about is what data was encrypted, right? Because you could be down at the very end, between 1 and 10% of your data being encrypted, and it's the most important data that your company runs on, whether it's your product, your customer lists, what have you. Um, and that's it's only 10% of your data, but it's going to put you out of business. On the other end of the spectrum, you could
Right?
have 70% of your data encrypted, but it's emails from marketing. And and I've always liked to say that if Chris gets hit with ransomware, our IT group is going to make fun of me. They're going to send me a new laptop. They're going to give me some extra user education and move on. If our CEO Anand gets hit with ransomware, there's going to be people running down the hallway to make sure that he's okay.
Yep.
And so that context of how important the data is needs to be taken into account with looking at the pervasiveness of the attack.
Yeah, so all you have to do is make sure to pick the right user's data to be successfully encrypted, and then just back up the important people. So as long as you do that, you're fine,
That's
except
right.
that's
Just
really
ignore all the people
not.
in marketing.
Dude, you're in marketing. You shouldn't say that. All right. So let's do a little bit of myth busting. So one of the questions, this question actually came from our CTO when the project was coming together. One of the things that I think a lot of organizations assume, the data center, right? These are our crown jewels, and so we're going to do whatever we can to protect it. But there's probably some vulnerability out in the remote office, the distributed office, the edge, however you want to define that, all the way down to the endpoint and laptop, because certainly there's less mature technology. So maybe that's where people are getting in from. Alternatively, there's certainly some folks out there that say, hey, you know what? If it's brick and mortar, I know how to secure that. I can spell firewall. I'm probably good, but that cloudy stuff, man, that's probably where it's getting in. So we tested on the question, where was the data that was encrypted? Where did it come from? How did it get in, et cetera? And again, what you see here, the shape of the bell curve on all three basically tells us that that's not true. That once they're in, they're equally able to affect all three kinds of infrastructure along the way. But again, I'm going to point out to you that while the bell curve shape is about the same, so the data is equally distributed as far as infraction and infection goes, that again, the backup admins and the security professionals, those two middle bands of each set of four, they are seeing the problem worse than those on the edges. Chris, that brings us back to the naivety that we talked about earlier.
I totally agree, and it's the reality for us in the field is that the data lives everywhere at this point. As a matter of fact, we have many people that I talk to who don't know where all their data is. So this chart makes perfect sense to me that the security professionals and the backup admins would be taking a more skeptical view about the pervasiveness.
Yeah. All right, but we're not done with the bad news yet. So we've talked about how widespread it gets from a production data perspective. We've talked about all the platforms are equally vulnerable along the way. Perhaps there's nothing that makes you more equally vulnerable than the unpatched platform of choice. And it turns out that while we would like to presume that perhaps the bad actors are, they're just finding any way they can get in at all, turns out the bad actors are pretty smart. They know what they're looking for.
They do. And one of the things that I take away from this chart, as well as a couple that we're going to pull up next, is that, if it's an opportunistic attack, it's probably somebody just accidentally clicking on a link and I'll call it an automated piece of malware is going to try its best to infect you. When we start talking about the specific applications, when we start talking about NAS and Oracle databases and VMware, we're starting to have to think about there's most likely somebody with their hands on keyboard, eyes on glass in your environment who is probing around and figuring out what you have and the best way to attack you. So this tells me that what is that, 40, 70, 80% of respondents
Yep.
have a pretty significant problem outside of just, air quotes, ransomware.
So, and I didn't get to cover this earlier, but this talks about once they're in, right? And I think the way that I've learned it from you and some of the other folks that are in the security teams that we've worked with along the way, it seems like there's almost two stages to how a cyber event actually happens. This is the second stage. Once they're in, they find servers that are unpatched, et cetera. Um, but how they get in, that comes right back to those silly humans and clicking, right?
It does, and it's amazingly frustrating because the number one entry point for cyber attacks is still phishing. It's still email. The user clicking the link, and that's been true for, gosh, probably almost 20 years now.
That's crazy to me. All right, so we have a lot more that we want to cover along the way. Let's move on to our next section. We're going to talk about I think the title of the slide for this is Money Matters, right? So we're going to look at time as a function of money. Certainly when we talk about anything in the backup space and the data protection space, certainly downtime starts to be involved here. Let's talk about the time necessary to work with ransomware. Now, I love the fact that for most organizations, once that bad event happens, they're going to start off right away and say, okay, it's time to pull out that playbook. It's time to solve for this. This is not a quick fix.
It's not, and And when you start taking into account the statistics from the data protection report of the general cost of downtime being $88,000 per hour, 88 and change, I think it was. I forget what the exact number was, but when we're talking about 1 to 2 weeks of downtime, or even a week of downtime, that we're talking about real money in both hard and soft costs. And for a lot of organizations, that's going to be detrimental. That could very well put you out of business. And we it's too bad that we have to think about it like that, but we really do need to start thinking about like what is the cost of downtime. And that's also one of the reasons why organizations, I think, choose to pay the ransom, because they believe it's faster, it's going to get them back up and running faster than their other options. And we know that's not necessarily the case, but it's goes back to an earlier slide of the folks who don't have a plan. There's a little bit of panic that gets involved. Let's just pay the ransom and hope for the best. And hope is not a strategy.
Amen on that. Amen on that. All right, so let's talk about some of the ways that why this prolongs the process overall. So because I think some folks misunderstand all that's involved here. One of the ways that can both accelerate or potentially slow down the process is as third parties come in. When we talk about smaller organizations, they're going to need experts to come in, including, like the Tiger team at Veeam, to help be part of the remediation process. But then, Chris, you've mentioned before that when we talk about things like when law enforcement or negotiations come in, that can also protract the overall experience as well. Can you break down some of these as far as where third parties help and or hinder?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's great to see, first of all, that organizations are calling their IT vendors, right? They're calling companies like Veeam to say we're having a problem, we're hit. And of course, we've got our SWAT team inside of Veeam support that does an amazing job of helping customers get out of these types of problems. And so that's fantastic. Where we start to see the slowdown or issues with timing is exactly when law enforcement gets involved, or lawyers start getting involved, because we have to figure out what are the legal obligations to the company.
Sure.
And we need to, it takes time to get that ransomware negotiator. It takes time for law enforcement to come in and do their investigation. And actually, during that time, you may not have access to your data center. I've actually seen instances where an organization was hit with ransomware. It was, let's call it one row in their data center, and they lost access to the entire building because the law enforcement walked in and said, we don't know the scope of this, so we're just going to cordon off everything. And so all of those pieces take time, and during that time, nothing technical is necessarily happening.
So, and I think it'd be easy for some organizations listening on the call today to assume that perhaps, well, my data doesn't have, federal implications or military or bio, or, you can think of all the things that it doesn't have. But I think if you step back for a second, recognizing the fact that for the most part, most organizations, when they first get attacked, they don't know how pervasive that encryption is or what the bad actor was looking for. And so it's not unreasonable that you would see that, hey, it's not just one server, it's a couple servers. Hey, it's more than a couple applications. We're just going to yellow tape everything because we don't want you touching anything until we know whether it's safe or not. And so it may not even be a third party that locks you down. It could just be your executive team or your IT team that says, we don't want anybody touching anything because we don't know what's clean and what's not. And just something as simple as that. And all of a sudden now you've incurred this massive outage. Oh, by the way, if you can't get back to the original metal, now you have to wait on alternative metal, whether that's going to be drop shipped to you. There's a supply chain problem that many IT organizations are facing right now. or whether you're going to go cloudy, et cetera. So there's all of a sudden that time gets really protracted along the way. But let's keep on moving because it's not just about time. There's also, and Chris, I think this is probably one of my most favorite pieces of insight that came out of this is I think there's a lot of organizations out there, if you've not personally been involved in a ransomware event, there is kind of a mystique. I think the media protracts this a little bit, where hey, I got hit, I paid my Bitcoin, somebody gives me this magic wand of incantation, and all of a sudden now everything works again. That's actually not how it works. In this case, Chris, let me show you, let me break down some of this data for you. We just look at the number of organizations that paid. I was in an event last week, and the majority of organizations said, no, I will not pay, right? But the reality is, of the 1,000 organizations that actually got hit, it's wonderful to say that if you've never been hit, by the way, but it's a good theory. But of the 1,000 organizations that were actually hit, 76% of them did pay. That's problem number one. Problem number two, roughly a third, 24 out of the 76, right? So a fourth overall, but a third of those who paid actually still couldn't recover even after they paid the Bitcoin. Does that surprise you?
Not at all. As a matter of fact, I'm surprised that that number isn't bigger because it's been well documented that I'll call them ransomware organizations because they do act like corporations themselves, are spending more of their time and money in QA on the attack than they are on the remediation. So the decryptor, if you will, that you get may have the wrong encryption key because they're using so many different symmetric keys, or I'm sorry, asymmetric keys, and it may just simply not work. But you know, for the 52% of folks who were able to recover their data, that's great. The question is, how long did that take? Because
Right.
that decryption tool probably isn't the fastest thing in the world either. It's probably
Nope.
not as fast as the encryption, the initial encryption.
That goes back to poor Q&A. The bane of every part of IT. Okay, so 3 out of 4 organizations paid. That's a problem. 1 out of 3 who paid still couldn't recover. The others, we talked about a protracted time. Really, the thing that we ought to be maybe focusing on is that beautiful green wedge. That is, by the way, technically Veeam green, just to be clear and not so subtle. 19%, only 1 in 5 organizations said they were able to recover without paying. In my mind, Chris, this is why we're doing this webcast, right? This is why Veeam is in business, is to help the other 81% of organizations be able to make that claim overall. That's the goal, isn't it?
That's absolutely the goal, and that's why we focus a lot on the speed of recovery. I mean, you know, you think about various attacks over the years. There are a number of organizations that had the data, they had their backups, and they made the business decision that it was perceived to be faster to pay the ransom than to restore from the backup. As a matter of fact, going back to my hope comment, they pay the ransom, get back what they can, and then recover the rest from their backups. And you know, it's that hope strategy.
That's right.
Um, I had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine who's a malware researcher when this first came out, and his comment when he saw this chart was that 5% of folks where no ransom was asked for means the malware probably just failed.
See, I was thinking that was arson. That's what when Dave Russell talks about that, that's the part he's concerned about is, was that really around, I just came in to do damage to you. It was never about getting money back. I just wanted to damage your organization.
That's always a possibility as well.
So, all right. Now you're a researcher that's out there, certainly for everyone else that's out there as well. This is one of those screens that, if you've been multitasking while you've been listening to the event, this is one you should look up, take a screenshot of, and have this conversation with folks. There's a lot in this that really ought to be hopefully motivating a reconsideration of the data protection strategy. Now we're talking about remediation. We're talking about how to recover from this. Let's double click down into, how bad does this get? Now again, looking at the unbiased sample as far as um, we talked earlier about the 47% of data that was successfully encrypted. We asked organizations, what were they able to get back, right, out of this global sampling? Now, there's actually two sets of samples here. The data protection trends we published in February, they said 1,300 of the 3,400 respondents said they were attacked. Of those, they were able to get back on average 64% of their data. On the right-hand side, this is from the ransomware research, another 1,000 on the end for that one. And they said they were able to get back 69. If we split the difference, 64, 69, call it 66 and a little bit-ish, right? Which essentially means out of nearly 3,000 respondents between the two surveys, on average, you'll get back 2/3 of your data using whatever your tool set is that you've got right now. Um, uh, so you get back 2/3 of what was encrypted. We said earlier, half of your data, 47%, gets encrypted. 2/3 times 1/2, so basically 1/6. You should basically plan on writing off about 16% of your data every time you get attacked as non-recoverable. That's crazy to me, Chris.
It's it's a painful lesson for a lot of organizations. And going back to my earlier comment about, the importance of the data, it really speaks to the need to both be testing your technology, your backups, and the data to make sure that it's recoverable, but also to be testing your disaster recovery plans and make sure that what needs to happen in order to make that number 100%.
Yep. All right, so let's talk about now. Let's start pivoting from the problems to how we can start to find some resolutions that comes out of this. Certainly, the greatest limiter as to whether or not you'll be able to recover or not is, do you still have backups? Right. Chris, you tell a great story around this, around this increases the likelihood that you'll pay. Let's walk folks through this. The question that was asked in the survey was, did the threat actor modify the backup repositories as part of the attack? And I'm just going to fade this down to, it looks like 68%. So in 2 out of 3 attacks, they were able to impact most, all, or at least some of those backup repositories. Chris, without the backups, there's no other choices than to pay, is there?
It's an ROI calculation for the bad guys. It really is, and they're going to do everything that they possibly can to ensure that you pay, and they're going to take away every option that you have. And there is an accountant in the ransomware groups who is doing this math. And the other thing that's interesting about this is that, in order to find and attack those repositories, there's got to be a lot of issues, whether it's lack of segmentation, technical issues, that type of thing, where we're not protecting them, we don't have a set of data that's air gapped or immutable. But it also implies that, again, there's eyes on glass and there's a bad actor in your environment.
Right. Right. Okay, but let's flip this over. So there is some good news. So it turns out, now I'm going to discount the 6% of organizations that said they did not attempt. I don't think any bad actor didn't attempt. They just can't tell whether they're successful or not, or maybe they couldn't find them. But let's focus instead on the 26% who said that their backup repositories survived. And whether that was because they couldn't affect them or they couldn't find them, or maybe that just because they were using a different kind of network topology, which is really the best practice. But any way you look at it, this is the hero scenario, right? This is where if the backup survived, 1 in 4 cases, then you might get to be part of that 19% that said they restored without pay.
Absolutely, and that's partially a technology conversation, right? Talking about segmentation and proper access controls, that type of thing. But it's also a process conversation, right? We talk a lot here at Veeam about the 3-2-1 rule. making sure that you've actually got verified backups that are air gapped or off site. And so, I would suppose that the 26% of people who were able to survive were using best practices across the board.
Right. No, I think that's a fair read. So if you're taking screenshots, if you're taking notes, this would be the second of the ones that we would, certainly wholeheartedly recommend along the way. Okay, so we're going to talk, we're going to keep working down this path of looking at the repositories and looking at what are the other technologies and best practices. Um, one of the other lessons learned from this is, okay, so we're going to restore data. One of the big questions is, how do you ensure that the data that you're going to restore is actually safe, clean data? Now, to kind of emphasize this, remember we talked at the very beginning that ransomware and cyber attacks are a kind of disaster. If you think about the other kinds of disasters, fire, flood, power, earthquake, whatever, right? In all of those cases, the data that was on the server right before the water or right before the fire or right before the wind, right? The data that was there right before everything broke, that was good data. And so if you have a replica, a backup, a snap, some other iteration of that, from milliseconds before the crisis, you take that copy, you spin it up as fast as you can, and we call that BCDR, right? There's a lot more to it than that, but you get the idea, right? Um, I'm going to tell you, and I'm hoping Chris isn't going to disagree with me, the copy that was there 10 seconds before the crisis is exactly not the copy that you want when you're trying to recover from ransomware, because it's probably just as encrypted as the copy 10 seconds later. Chris, can I get an amen?
Amen. And it's not necessarily that the copy is encrypted, it's that the threat is sitting there. And once it goes live, it's gonna re-encrypt your data. And so, the folks who are using immutable storage, that's fantastic. Um, but the folks who are using an isolated test environment or a sandbox, which in Veeam's case would be data labs, those are the folks who I would suppose to have a more I'll call it mature incident response process,
Yeah.
who are going in and using those indicators of compromise and all of the intelligence that's been put together through the investigation and pulling out the bad data and only restoring the good stuff. The people who kind of scare me are the ones the 7% who said, yeah, we restored it back to production and just kept an eye on it.
Let me unpack what we're seeing here, because there's actually two different concepts that are part of this chart, and I want to make sure that folks get both of them. So the original question was, how do you ensure that your data is clean, right? And so you see there's a broad range of options here. There's 31% on that right-hand side. Let's just focus on that for a second, on that say that they're using immutable storage, and that's one way they're ensuring they're clean. Chris, you talk about the was it an Nalgene bottle or the vase. Talk about how immutability does not ensure cleanliness, and then we'll double back on the rest of the wedge.
Yeah, absolutely. So you know, I drink out of an Nalgene bottle. I've got my water bottle actually in my hand right now, and the bottle is secure, just like immutability is secure. It's securing the contents,
No
but
leaks.
no leaks. I don't know if I'm drinking water or if I'm drinking gasoline. And the same thing is true inside an immutable object, where you don't know what that you've got the data, but you don't know its status. And so just kind of trusting that the data that we put in there is good is a recipe for disaster.
Now let's make sure that we're not, bashing this. We're not saying the immutability is insufficient. What we're saying is you're solving two different problems, right? So problem number one is make sure that what goes in the backup repository is only what you wanted to put in the repository, whether that's water or gasoline or bourbon, right? Make sure that the repository is a good repository. That is question number one. If we take those folks that chose that gray wedge on the screen, take those out of the equation. So now the N goes from 719 up to 555. So we've just, all we've done is just taken the gray wedge out. Now we can look at, okay, so now that we know that we actually have survivable data because it was immutable, now let's look at what are the methods of which somebody actually ensures the data is clean. In this case, Chris, I love the fact you started talking about this earlier. 46% of the respondents said they are using a sandbox. They're actually doing what we would call a staged restore or a secure restore. They're using an intermediary to make sure that it is clean before reintroducing it to the production environment. Love that idea.
Love, absolutely love that idea, and you make a good point that it's not an either or scenario with immutability. I mean, and actually all of the recommendations that we make is not a single is a single silver bullet for your BCDR strategy, right? I mean, it's taking all of these pieces together that's going to give you the best chance for survival. And the folks who are restoring to a sandbox and doing some kind of staged restore are most definitely using a mutable storage, right? So we're combining those tactics together to make sure that we've got the best chance to get our data back.
That's right. That's right. So let's get into kind of, I think it's our last section. We're gonna put a few more of these best practice technology concepts together. Certainly, immutability is one of the key elements that are there. There's not a single way to get immutability along the way. One of the questions that was asked in the lessons learned that came out of this is what kinds, ideally plural, of repositories that do you have that are either offlineable, air gappable, immutable, any way to make sure that they are not potential targets and accessible to those bad actors. Now, I think there's a couple things that you see here. Certainly, there's a couple different kinds of clouds, right? There's the hyperscale clouds like Amazon Azure. There's managed cloud services, BAS and DRAS, that can offer immutability. Certainly, there's different kinds of on-premises disk-based solutions, and I love the fact that tape is there too. Chris, a couple things I want to point out that I think are interesting. Certainly, the fact that only 5% of organizations, that little bitty red wedge on the bottom, said that they don't have any immutability or air gapping solution. I love that. And then the other thing is that when we aggregate out the different kinds of solutions, I love the fact that 1 in 4 organizations, 1 in 5, 1 in 4-ish, still using tape, right? Tape still has a matter there. But then you've got 67% of organizations, at least one of their disk tiers is immutable or air gappable. 3 out of 4 are using a cloud that has immutability or air gapping along the way. And when you add all those numbers up, it's well over 100% along the way, meaning that is it possible that you can actually be air gapped or immutable in every tier of your data protection lifecycle?
Absolutely. And this goes back to my earlier comment. There's not just one thing that you need to do. The folks in this survey have obviously recognized that, yeah, the cloud is great, and having your repos out in Amazon or Azure or GCP is fantastic. But to your point, tape is nearly forever, and it's the most immutable thing that you can get once you pop it out of the drive.
Yeah, take it out of a drive, put it on a shelf. Bad actors ain't going to get there, right?
Yep.
Unless they're on site, in which case you have a much wider variety of problems. In fact, I thought it was interesting. We do ask the question also, immutable or not, but just in addition to disk, as part of your overall backup solution, what percentage of the production data? So this is not organizations, this is production data. At some point makes it onto a tape, or at some point makes it on a cloud. And I think it's interesting here that we say zero on the left-hand side. 8% of organizations said we don't use any tape at all, zero, right? 1% said they don't use cloud. Great, right? On the other side, on 100%, on the far right edge, 5% said everything goes to tape for something, right? So those are probably highly regulated organizations. Whereas 11% said everything goes to cloud at some point. But when you balance it out, yeah, cloud is more popular than tape, and tape has a role and cloud has a role. But overall, 45% of data at some point shows up on tape. That's that data that really has a long term, a 5-year, a 10-year, a 30-year, a 50-year, an infinite retention. That's what tape is for, right? Meanwhile, cloud, Highly agile, secondary use cases, DR is a good one. 62% is going to cloud. I love the fact that organizations are using each for what they're good at, above and beyond disk.
And Dave Russell is definitely smiling every time the slide gets shown.
Yeah, it makes me wonder why he didn't want to come present this slide with us. So. All right, we got a couple last things. As long as we're touting out some of our friends, let's give a nod out to our friend Melissa Palmer for these next two. So one of the questions that comes up is, and I think she actually titled the slide when we did the interpretation for it. It's orchestrate and test, or hope and fail. And now I'm gonna talk to all the backup peeps out there for just a second. So this is something David Russell and I have preached on for a very long time. When organizations were asked how do you automate or verify or validate that you actually have recoverable data, it breaks my heart that 60% of organizations say the log said it's good, so it must be good, right? I cannot tell you over 32 years as a backup person how many times the backup log has said everything was fine, and then I gave up a 3-day weekend because it wasn't. Right? The backup log basically says the tape drive didn't error out, the VSS requester and writer didn't error. I could at least touch all the servers that I thought I was supposed to. That is not the same thing as do I have restorable servers and workloads. So those folks got it wrong. Look, there's a lot of times you try to be politically correct. This time, 60%, if you're relying on the backup logs alone, you got it wrong, right? There's another 44% that said they test to make sure that what they wrote to the drive is readable. That was good when tape was the problem 20 years ago. This is not the case. In this case, the hero scenario here is for 1 in 6 organizations. They actually do what they ought to be doing, which is every night after the backups are done, they automatically restore one of those servers and then test it. Now, if you try to do that manually, you're going to fail. You're going to end up relying on the logs because it's hard, right? We have a feature called Sure Backup. That's one of the things that's differentiator for us. And excuse me, where every night we create a sandbox, same sandbox that you'd use for validating clean restores, and we can test for that. All right, we have I think just one more key data slide that we want to kind of touch through, and that is, so there's the concept of how do you ensure that you have recoverable data, and then there's the how fast are you going to get it back up again. And in this case, let me just unpack for the folks. There's 3 ways. So when organizations were asked, what does failover look like? What does failback look like? 29% said they're going to manually reconfigure, which I think is crazy because your boss's boss is standing over your shoulder. That's just not going to work, right? As a BCDR guy for 15 plus years, I can tell you that's not going to work. Predefined scripts are good for the day after you wrote them and pretty much not after that. The way that most folks ought to be thinking about this, and I'll just make a plug for, I do a lot of work with scouts, with youth. And when we teach that first aid merit badge, we talk about, your chance of survival is based on shrinking the time between snakebite and hospital. Right? That's the whole point of every BCDR exercise, is shrinking the time between snakebite and hospital. If you're doing this, if you're reconfiguring scripts, if you're redefining it manually, that's not the answer. This is the answer. The answer is orchestrated workflows. How do I speed up that time along the way? Chris, we have just a few seconds left on this, but any last thoughts as far as how do we speed up time or ensure better recoverability?
The first thing that I would say is having a plan, which is mundane. It's hard to do because it's frankly boring. But having that plan and documenting that plan is going to be key to speeding up your recovery time. And the key words that I'm going to key on that slide is the word manually. Anything that you can automate is
Yes,
going to get you to the hospital faster.
that's right.
And I love my automation and orchestration. So if there's something that we can do that I don't have to click buttons for or spend my weekends doing, I'm all in for. because it's going to make our lives easier and it's going to get us back up and running faster. But we have
Well,
to start with a comprehensive plan.
well said. All right. Look, we've covered a lot of data on today's call. Hopefully, what we've done is given you some fresh ideas. Please feel free to download the ransomware research report. You can download that at vee.am/rw22. If you have questions about anything that we've covered today coming from the Veeam research team and these unbiased research panels, we're here to help you have better conversations to hopefully help you prepare for things like ransomware better. But you can email us at strategicresearch@veeam.com for any questions along the way. With the end of my time, Chris, thanks for joining for today's session. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. Thanks, Jason.
With that, on behalf of Veeam, thanks for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day.